Welcome to episode 62 of the Search with Canada podcast, recorded on Friday the 22nd of May 2020. My name is Mark Williams-Cook, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the new Lighthouse metrics and the Lighthouse version 6 update that's just been released. And we'll also have a quick discussion about unlinked citations and no-follow links. Before we kick off, I thought it'd be really cool to mention I saw yesterday that Google Webmasters has announced its own podcast, which will surely be better than this one, and it's called Search Off the Record, and it's going to have people like John Mueller and Martin Splitt from Google on it. I listened to the 2.5 minute ad that they ran about Search Off the Record, and essentially they're saying they're going to be talking about what they're essentially doing behind the scenes at Google, what they're working on day to day, and just give webmasters some insight maybe into what's coming before it's been announced. It's not there as kind of a podcast version of the documentation. They're going to be talking about other things. So it's called Search Off the Record. Looks like it's going to be really great. I'll definitely be listening to that. So check it out. I saw an interesting discussion this last week come up about unlinked citations, and I wanted to talk about it quickly because it's a topic I've discussed before with other SEOs, and this is around the ideas, if we just think about links in general, about how Google is handling different types of link. And in this conversation, I think it would be good to include the changes that were made to no follow that we've talked about in previous episodes. So if you haven't kind of heard of that before or listened to those episodes or you've missed it, Google, I believe it was the 1st of March, said they were going to make this change whereby they started treating the no follow tag as a hint rather than a directive. The difference being a directive is something that a search engine will always obey, and a hint is something they will use in combination normally with other factors to decide whether they want to honor it or not. And the general thinking about that was that Google is trying to navigate its way around an issue they've kind of created for themselves, which is that many editorial sites, such as newspapers, will just blanket no follow every external link on their site. And they're doing this for obvious kind of risk mitigation factors themselves, because linking out to other sites, there's that perceived risk of, does it look like a paid link, or is it a trustworthy site? Are we accidentally linking to a competitor and helping them? So as a fix-all solution, many of these editorial sites just took the decision to no follow every external link. And this saved them the time and hassle of having to manually go through and make decisions about which link should be followed and which link shouldn't, because it's not really important to them. That did create this side issue for Google, which is that part of the, if you want to call it PageRank algorithm, the algorithm they use in total to look at how web pages are linking together, relies on the fact that good web pages are also linking to other good web pages and citating them and mentioning them, so Google can take these hints. So no follow, the definition was that this no follow tag stops links from passing PageRank. Essentially, it stops that importance getting across. So in this no follow update, as we've covered before, as I said, they have changed their position and said we're going to start treating no follow as a hint, although as it was reported, that hasn't actually happened yet, so we don't really know what the impact of that was. And at the same time, Google released some granular forms of no follow, which were rel sponsored and rel UGC being user generated content, which allowed webmasters to specifically say, okay, this link is paid for, this link is generated by users, or this link is no follow. And the general, again, thought consensus behind this is that, firstly, Google said that you don't have to use those specific granular level rel sponsored or rel UGC. It's absolutely fine just to keep no follow, which to me, and I think a few people agree with this, would indicate that maybe they are using this voluntary tagging system to help train their models to be able to spot, okay, this whole group of links here were marked as sponsored, these ones are just marked as no follow, but they look really similar, therefore in terms of how we treat them as a hint, we're going to fall on the side of the fence that they're probably sponsored. So it helps them, I think, detect whether they should be respecting that no follow tag or not. So that's an interesting thought now about whether, when these changes kick in and Google is treating no follow as a hint, whether these links from editorial sites that are just blanket no following do become followed in a way, if you like. So there's that whole discussion about how Google may or may not be treating links with no follow. The discussion I picked up on unlinked citations is something, as I said, I've spoken about before. I find it really interesting, which is that this discussion about whether someone mentions your brand or even your website URL and doesn't link to it, whether Google counts this or not. And interestingly enough, someone directly just asked John Mueller this on Twitter the other day, and he was kind enough to reply. And his reply was, the short version is usually not, in my opinion, and the long version is somewhat hard to squeeze into tweet form, as you can imagine, and I'm not in the mood to write a long essay, so hopefully the short version is useful as a starting point. I think it is useful as a starting point. So to kind of take us back in time a bit, it was in 2013 that I saw this first discussed, and Google said they could use these unlinked citations for discovery, so that they can use them to discover new URLs, new web pages that they weren't aware of before, but they didn't use them for ranking. I've previously discussed patents before that have been filed by Google that include both explicit and implied links. So if I just read out, I'm going to read out part of a ranking patent that was filed by Google that mentions implied links, which says, an implied link is a reference to a target resource, e.g. a citation to the target resource, which is included in a source resource, but not an express link to the target resource. So sorry, express, not explicit link. So, but it's not an express link to the target resource. Thus, a resource in the group can be the target of an implied link without a user being able to navigate to the resource by following the implied link. And there's been other mentions in patents about a link can be an express link or an implied link. An express link exists where a resource explicitly refers to the site. An implied link exists where there is some other relationship between a resource and the site. So the fact that these things are mentioned in Google patents when they're talking about, so the first patent I was specifically about how to rank web pages looking at links and what things should be considered. It's interesting that Google is starting to look at, or has been, I shouldn't say start to, has been looking at these things. The more recent speculation is that brand mentions, things like that, can be used for entity identification. So there's long been this push by Google to switch to, as they call it, this things not strings model, which is this graph kind of database where they're building up an understanding of what things are part of other things, and what the relationships between those things are, which then gives you a framework to be able to answer more complicated questions. So, Google, if you type something like, who is the founder of Warner Brothers, Google can just give you normally an instant answer to that. And a question like that actually requires a huge amount of understanding from the machine to understand that Warner Brothers is a company. A company is founded by things called founders. Founders are types of people, and these are the people that we've identified are founders and related to Warner Brothers. So it's really interesting to see how all of this meshes together. I wanted to kind of summarize it really, which is that, in my opinion, Google is using these unlinked implied citations in some way for discovery, kind of like they said, maybe for entity identification. but I think it's fair to say that where you can get a link, it's always going to be a lot better. So if you're doing kind of link reclamation, where you're getting alerts where your brand, your websites, your products have been mentioned and they're not linked, that's great. It's brilliant. People are talking about you. There's all kinds of research as well done around how Google's looking at how people are talking about brands and entities online and if they're positive or negative. But if you can still get links from those people, I certainly wouldn't stop doing that. Lighthouse version 6 has just been released. If you haven't used it before, where have you been? Lighthouse is an automated website auditing tool that's basically there to help developers find opportunities to diagnose and improve user experience of their sites. You can access it if you're in Chrome by hitting F12, and that'll open up the developer panel, and it should be called Lighthouse in the list of tabs. It used to be called Audit or Audits. It's called Lighthouse now, so it's been renamed. And this will allow you to run a set of audits on your site, so performance, progressive web app checks, best practice, accessibility, SEO, and you can simulate mobile or run them on desktop. So I use this really regularly for looking at the performance of sites. It's a really nice tool to get some feedback on that. Just one note that's worth taking into consideration: if you are going to use it, I set it up so I always run it in an incognito window that doesn't have any other Chrome extensions running. So other Chrome extensions can interfere with the results you will get. So I try and run it from like a clean instance of the browser. And it gives some really helpful metrics. So the two that I use regularly with Lighthouse are TTI and FCP. So TTI stands for time to interactive, and that measures the time from when the page starts loading to when its main sub-resources have loaded and it's capable of reliably responding to user input frequently. So essentially when they can start using the page. So it's TTI. And first contentful paint is FCP, and that's how long it takes for the site to start being rendered on the screen. And it's interesting because FCP, I really like it as a metric because it's not just kind of like how long it took to load this web page, because it's looking at when things are starting appearing on your screen. This is actually what directly impacts the satisfaction of the user in terms of site speed. So if your page took 3 seconds to load and it went from being completely blank for 2.9 of those seconds, and in that last tenth of a second it kind of just all loaded, and you had another website that also took 3 seconds to load, but after half a second it started loading like the main text, navigation, things like that, and it still took 3 seconds to have the full page load, but people could see that content earlier, you'll tend to find those users will feel they'll experience that site as much faster, and they'll have less frustration, they'll be more satisfied. So FCP has always been a really interesting metric for me, and how we can get the pages loading as quickly as possible to try and keep people engaged in the site. So the big announcements for version 6 of Lighthouse is they have introduced some really interesting new metrics. So there's 3 new metrics they're bringing in. They've replaced 3 metrics, so 3 in, 3 out. The ones going out are first meaningful paint, not first contentful paint, first CPU idle, and max potential FID. I'm not going to talk about them because they're on the way out. So we want to talk about the new metrics. So there's 3 new metrics. The first one is largest contentful paint, which is LCP. And Lighthouse described this as a measurement of perceived loading experience. So very similar to what we just talked about with the first contentful paint, FCP. So this is largest contentful paint. It marks the point during page load when the primary or largest content has loaded and is visible to the user. LCP is an important complement to the first contentful paint, FCP, which only captures the very beginning of the loading experience. LCP provides a signal to developers about how quickly a user is actually able to see the content of a page. An LCP score below 2.5 seconds is considered good. So one of the issues I think they were having with FCP, with the first contentful paint, was this was really counting as soon as kind of anything was starting to be rendered on the page, the first kind of pixel, which isn't necessarily always helpful to users. So this complements this large contentful paint is looking at when this main body is loaded. So they're saying this gives a better average signal of when the user is kind of seeing things loaded and are going to be happy and their experience is going to be improved. And they've set the bar at that as 2.5 seconds or under is good. The second new metric they've introduced is called Cumulative Layout Shift, CLS, which I had a guess at what it would be, and I'm really happy to say is that, and it's a measurement of visual stability. So CLS, Cumulative Layout Shift, quantifies how much a page's content visually shifts around. A low CLS score is a signal to developers that their users aren't experiencing undue content shifts. A CLS score below 0.1 is considered good. So you've probably all experienced this, especially on advert-heavy websites, where I think it's actually sometimes used intentionally as a trick to get you to click on ads, which is you start loading a web page and it becomes interactive, so you can click on stuff, and then just as you go to click on something, kind of the whole navigation shifts as a new element loads in. I've certainly seen this on those kind of clickbait types of sites where they're saying, here's 10 pictures, of what celebrities look like now, and then they want you to click previous and next. And the last thing to normally load is an advert which is very close to the previous next. So you kind of look at the image, and then half a second later you go to click on next, but just before you do, a new advert loads, pushes the next previous links down, and sure enough there's an advert there that you've accidentally clicked on. And that can just be frustrating anyway for users, because as people are going through sites quickly, they may want to just start clicking and interacting with things before it's fully loaded. So Cumulative Layout Shift, CLS, is now a way that Lighthouse has got of measuring how much of the page is shifting around as it's loading. The third new metric is called Total Blocking Time, TBT, and this quantifies load responsiveness, measuring the total amount of time when the main thread was blocked long enough to prevent input responsiveness. TBT measures the total amount of time between first contentful paint, FCP, and time to interactive, TTI. So that was one of the first initial metrics I spoke about. It is a companion to the TTI, and it brings more nuance to quantifying main thread activity that blocks a user's ability to interact with your page. So this is essentially the time from when the content starts appearing on the page to when it becomes interactive. So this is a really nice, as it says here, layer of nuance. So before, the TTI was just from when we requested the web page to when it was interactive, and that could sometimes be artificially blown up by if the first contentful paint took a long time to start to load. So it might be that the delay between first contentful paint and interactive is really small, but the TTI is still really high because you waited 3-4 seconds before the FCP even started. So this total blocking time, TBT, measures the time between these two metrics. So the time between first contentful paint and time to interactive. So at a glance, you can see if you've got issues with the web page starting to render, or actually the block you've got in terms of interactivity is this loading time. There's another note saying, additionally, total blocking time, TBT, correlates well with the field metric first input delay, FID, which is a core web vital. So along with this, Lighthouse have recalculated how they score performance. So each of these metrics previously had a weight associated with it. So you get a 0 to 100 performance score when you run these audits. And because they now have new metrics and they've shifted some old metrics around, they have recalculated the weightings of these metrics. So I'll put a link in the show notes at search.withcandor.co.uk that will link to, they did some analysis of how real websites were affected by these score changes. So they've actually published the data they collected there. And the summary is that around 20% of sites see noticeably higher scores. Around 30% have hardly any change, and around 50% see a decrease of at least 5 points. And along with this, really helpfully, they've published a scoring calculator which helps you see the difference between Lighthouse version 5 and Lighthouse version 6 scores. So when you run an audit now with Lighthouse version 6, the report will come back with a link to the calculator with your audit result already populated in it. So you can see, okay, well, if we've lost 10 points now between version 5 and version 6 of Lighthouse, exactly where you're losing those points. And really interestingly, the version 6 of Lighthouse comes with, where it can, source location links, which means that some of the issues that Lighthouse finds about a page can be tracked back to a specific line of source code, and the report will state the exact file and line that's relevant. So this is to make these changes really easy to explore in DevTools. So it's taking us forward a couple of steps. So rather than the historically more vague advice of, oh, you need to look at this category of thing to make your site faster, this will actually start to, where possible, be really specific in your source code to where you can make improvements. You may, some of you have been using Lighthouse through a Chrome extension, because there is actually a Chrome extension for Lighthouse. The part of this announcement for version 6 is they've said, unfortunately, the browser extension was too complicated to support, and the Lighthouse team felt that because the Chrome DevTools Lighthouse panel is a better experience in that the report integrates with other panels, they could reduce their engineering overhead by simplifying the Chrome extension. So instead of running Lighthouse locally, the browser extension Lighthouse now uses the PageSpeed Insights API. And they said they recognize that will not be a sufficient replacement for some of their users because there are some key differences. So the key differences are the PageSpeed Insights is unable to audit non-public websites, and that's because it's run via a remote server. So if you run your Chrome Lighthouse report through DevTools, it's run locally through that browser, so you can audit anything that you can see in your browser essentially. Also, the PageSpeed Insights is not guaranteed to use the latest Lighthouse release, and the PageSpeed Insights is a Google API, and using it constitutes accepting the Google API terms of service, so not everyone may be able to accept those terms of service. So there are, it seems, some quite good reasons now, if you are using the Chrome extension for Lighthouse, to actually switch and start using the inbuilt version in Chrome DevTools. And it's, even if you're kind of not a technical person, not a developer, as I said, it's really easy to access. You just hit F12 and it's just there under Lighthouse. You can check which audits you want to run, just hit run, and it runs in pretty much the same way. There's actually a whole host of more information and changes in version 6 of Lighthouse. So these were just the main ones that I wanted to make everyone aware of. I think that will impact maybe recommendations and things we look at for SEO, and helpful things that will give us easier conversations with developers. So it's important that if we're doing technical SEO that we understand these new metrics, because these are, I think, these will become kind of standard in terms of how people are looking at performance. But there are loads more updates with things like continuous integration, and the Lighthouse audit looking at unused JavaScript, and a whole bunch of things that I think, if you're working with developers, I would strongly encourage you to get them to go and read the full post, which we'll link to, as I said, in search.withcandor.co.uk. And that's everything I've got time for in this episode. Thank you very much for listening. We're going to be back in 1 week's time, of course, which will be Monday, the 1st of June. So I hope you'll tune in then.